I remember in an email, Leonie, I guess you sort of described maybe your political coming of age or a sort of critical moment when you became an undergraduate, and it coincided with 9/11 and events, world events, which followed in the wake of that. I just wondered, could you take me back to that time and tell me some of the things which were making an impression on you and which perhaps have stayed with you and have perhaps motivated some of the themes that you've been interested in your subsequent career?
So I started my undergraduate politics degree in September 2001, and I wasn't a particularly political person prior to that point, but obviously it completely changed the way, well, it changed the way that politics was taught, certainly. And there was a lot of talk about it changing the world, which obviously is a theme that's addressed in this book. But it completely opened my eyes to how the world was changing at that point, and it completely changed my direction in life as well. I became very interested in terrorism and counterterrorism and how it was talked about in particular, and that is the direction that my academic career has taken ever since.
Yeah, and I guess those events affected a lot of people and in lots of different ways. And I suppose it might have, if you're studying politics, it might open up a whole range of different pathways through that. What was it, do you think, that drew you to the field of counterterrorism in particular versus some of the other avenues that you might have gone down?
I suppose it was that um, the it was a very it's hard to sort of describe and think about when you look back, because it was a very strange time.
Yeah,
um, and we were being told that the world was changing and that we were in incredible danger almost daily. It was obviously an incredibly shocking event, and it was constantly, I'm sure you remember this, it was constantly on rolling news on the
yeah,
television. It was something that you could not get away from. And it's a scary time, but it was also the changes that were being made in terms of our daily lives that were very strange. And this is speaking as someone who was living in a Western liberal democracy at the time. It's very different to people who were living in countries that were subsequently targeted. But our lives were changed in really quite dramatic ways, but also in quite banal ways that we perhaps didn't even notice at that moment. And so there was a feeling that everyone was sort of drawn into this narrative of the war on terror as it was being developed. And that was very interesting to me, because it was the stories that were being told about terrorism and counterterrorism that were that were quite that were very powerful, but were very, very interesting. And that's what drew me into that field, basically, to understand what these stories that were being told about how the world had changed and what needed to be done in
yeah,
order to protect people, how they were told, was fascinating to me and remain fascinating to me.
yeah. And did you have a kind of instinctive wish to push back against the narratives that were being put out? Because, as you say, they were very powerful. They were cast in existential, civilizational clash terms. But in your early 20s, were you sort of already sort of sensing, hey, there's probably more to it. There's probably more nuance. There's probably more things going on behind the scenes than perhaps these grand narratives allow.
Yeah, I remember one of my big kind of political awakening moments was the march against the war on Iraq. So that was in March 2003, just before, or February perhaps, but just before the war in Iraq happened. Millions of people across the world came together to protest against the war, and I called in sick to my Saturday job and caught a train down to London to join people there, and to see this sea of people in central London marching through the streets, asking for this not to happen, to push back against that, and to see the kind of problems that this would cause, the war against Iraq and the war on terror more broadly. It was very powerful to be part of that. It was something that had a real impact on my life, on my understanding of how ordinary people recognize the harms that are done by counterterrorism, and can and do push back against that. And to look back on that some 20 years later it's a sort of bittersweet moment, because obviously it didn't work. The war on Iraq did go ahead, and the war on terror became more entrenched and more problematic, and arguably is still with us today. But it did show that people are engaged, and people generally do push back against the violence of counterterrorism and the violence of war. And that was a very powerful thing to be a part of.
Yeah. And for people who listen to this, who perhaps don't know very much about counterterrorism studies, what are kind of its animating questions, or its concerns, or what kind of field? How would you sort of situate it as a field for people who don't know anything about it?
Counterterrorism studies, it sits in lots of fields, because its concerns with issues such as human rights, issues such as war and force and when to use that. It sits within the criminology field, because some counterterrorism scholars would argue that counterterrorism is effectively crime fighting. So we should see terrorism as a crime, and therefore we should fight it using criminological tools. It sits within the politics field. It's one of these fields which has a lot of different faces, basically. And that's a wonderful thing, in my opinion, because it brings in the scholarly concerns of lots of different disciplines and lots of different fields to ask very pressing questions about one of the kind of most important state activities of the present moment.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that very thing. When would you say, roughly speaking, the question became pressing? Because I was sort of thinking, if you go back decade by decade, there might be a point at which asking what is counterterrorism for wasn't a very meaningful question, or wasn't felt to be a very pressing question. But when do you think it actually comes on the agenda as something which merits very serious scrutiny?
It has a long history. It hasn't always been called counterterrorism, but I think we can say this is what is happening is similar to what is happening in the counterterrorism field today. So obviously terrorism itself, I mean, we probably should say something about this. Terrorism itself is a very contested concept. I'm sure that's people know that. But the first time it comes into use is in the French Revolution. So it's state terrorism. It's terrorism from above, and we don't really see counterterrorism at that point. When we see counterterrorism coming into usage, it's when the state itself is countering a terrorism from below. So particularly we see that in the 19th century when the so-called anarchist terrorists become active across, particularly in Europe and the United States. And we see a worldwide movement basically against anarchist terrorism, against the bomb throwers, where states work together and start to develop strategies to prevent this happening. So we see anarchist terrorists, particularly, as I said, in Europe, in Russia, in the United States. The dynamiters is what they were called, throwing dynamite and assassinating very high-profile people within those states. And then we see practices and language that becomes shared by these states as a means to counter them. And again, you wouldn't see this called counter-terrorism. It's kind of counter-anarchist or counter-dynamiters. But the practices that are used are things that we would recognize today in counter-terrorism of the present moment.
They might not have used the label counterterrorism, but we would recognize the common characteristic of the threat being conceived of as, in some cases, existential, and in nearly all cases, as exceptional. There's something about this which distinguishes it, in the eyes of the elite, from a criminal threat or a threat of any other kind. So it's an exceptional threat, and therefore it seems to call for exceptional measures. That seems to be a thread that runs through history and therefore runs through your book.
Yeah, exactly. It's seen as a civilizational threat. It's seen as an exceptional threat, and therefore things that have historically or fairly recently been unacceptable, such as torture, such as detention without trial, become acceptable. The kind of scope of acceptability widens, ostensibly just for this small moment and ostensibly just for this one group. But what we tend to see is that stretches and activities, the counter-terrorist activities that were previously only for a small group or directed towards a small group of so-called dangerous individuals who are seen as an existential threat to the state, it widens, and the state or the counterterrorism apparatus moves its gaze to a broader range of people, because these powers are quite helpful, right? It is quite helpful to not be constrained by the rule of law. So that is what tends to happen with these powers.
Yeah, and as you say in the book, there is a very strong narrative, a very clear, simple, black and white narrative that can be applied to the implementation of these powers, because there is this external threat which is perceived as potentially existential and bent on destruction. Therefore, a state can claim the right to use exceptional measures that would fall outside all norms in normal circumstances. It can claim that in applying such powers, it's protecting its citizenry, it's acting in the citizen's best interest. The problem, well, there are manifold problems, obviously, with that, but they seem to operate in a ratchet kind of effect. There doesn't often seem to be an ostensible rolling back of those powers, and they get misapplied, and they fall outside all conscionable norms. So I guess that there are multiple problems with that, but there's this sort of umbrella narrative that is used to advance them.
Yeah. And it's important to note that ratcheting up, because the effect of these powers is to say the state can protect you, the individual, the state can protect its citizens, because terrorism really spectacularly demonstrates that the state can't protect its the individuals within its borders. And so once powers are in place to protect those citizens, if another terrorist attack happens, then that again demonstrates it. And so you do have this ratcheting up of these powers. And this is, again, one of, as you said, the manifold problems. But this is one of the key problems with that the powers tend to be extended and tend to become often more draconian.
I guess the problem for democratically elected politicians is they cannot countenance, and I mean, I can understand why, the prospect of some spectacular security failure. Therefore, to them, it seems more palatable to perhaps use draconian powers to do things that happen out of sight, which maybe overreach and are misapplied, because the prospect of failure, on the other hand, would just be so terrible that they're willing to take that risk. In other words, they don't have some great sort of securitarian design on society, perhaps, but they see the risk of failing to protect the citizenry as one they're not willing to take.
Yeah, that is definitely something that you can trace through the ages of counterterrorism. But again, it's all about it's about the story that we tell about terrorism and counterterrorism. It's about the narrative. If the narrative is that this is an existential political threat to our society, then it is much more difficult to countenance those threats. But if the narrative is that terrorism is unfortunately, like crime, something that is a part of living in a modern society, then it becomes much more palatable to have a proportionate response to that, as we would to crime. We wouldn't have a police state because crime went up, we would hope. Yeah. but we can have that same response to terrorism. But for a variety of reasons, terrorism is seen as this very special type of activity that can and should be responded to in the ways that you're talking about there, in order that no threat is there, or that there is no possibility of a terrorist attack happening. And that's a very difficult thing to do in a modern society.
Yeah, because I mean, the sort of salient difference that occurs to me between crime and terrorism is that crime doesn't seek to draw attention to itself, whereas if a terrorist attack isn't spectacular and doesn't attract attention, then it's a failure. So it's a harder conversation to have than perhaps saying, you know, there will always be a certain level of crime in society. We'll try to tamp down on it. It's a harder argument to make that some level of spectacular terrorism is just something we've got to get used to and have got to learn to live with, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's partly because terrorism so clearly shows shows the citizens or the watchers of the attack that the state cannot protect the citizens. And so it becomes it's an attack on the social contract between citizens and states. And so it is a difficult thing for states to deal with. There's no question about that. But the issue here is how states respond to that fact. Quite often undermines the social contract anyway. And so there is then a danger from the state in terms of its overreach in protecting citizens against terrorism through its counterterrorism measures, that it actually undermines that very security that it is trying so hard to demonstrate.
Yeah. So in the field of counterterrorism studies, do you spend time looking at what works and what doesn't work and trying to discern? Because obviously the thing that I always go back to thinking is, well, I don't want to get on a plane and feel that nobody has thought about security, that there's been no attention paid whatsoever to the prospect of, and I don't even feel like I want to take a sort of calculated risk, although I know that any journey can, for any number of reasons, be a risk. But I want to kind of feel that something has been done, someone has been thinking about the prospect of terrorism. So how important is it to actually look at what works and what doesn't work within the field of counterterrorism?
There is a lot of research that goes into what works and what doesn't work. And you're absolutely right. Counterterrorism is, because we don't want to take a risk. Even though we know, for example, that statistically you're kind of more likely to drown in your own bathtub than you are to be in a terrorist attack, or we take huge risks when we cross the road as opposed to getting on a plane. But we still find as human beings, psychologically, we find terrorism so frightening because it says something about our moral worth as a human being, because we are being used as a means to an end if we are caught up in a terrorist attack. And so it's an offence to our moral worth, and that is one of the reasons why we find it so problematic and why people want counterterrorism measures in place. And that's perfectly understandable. But what we know is that the kind of measures that deter terrorist attacks are very banal measures. They are things like more security checks in airports. They are things like security barriers in public spaces. They're things that you wouldn't, well, you might notice and you might find them slightly annoying, but they wouldn't necessarily have a massive impact on your everyday life in the same way that, for example, a preventative war might.
Yeah.
So we know that those are the kind of activities that deter and prevent terrorist attacks. But we also know that the kind of activities, counter-terrorist activities that create grievances and therefore encourage further terrorist attacks are the quite expansive activities and preventative activities that target particular communities and that don't appear to have as strong an influence on undermining terrorism or preventing terrorism than these very, well, relatively simple and everyday activities that are not unproblematic, but that on balance, and that's key, on balance, prevent without creating huge grievances that go on to cause further terrorist attacks down the line.
Yeah. And of course, it's easy to become a bit fixated on air travel. We know from the last 10 or 20 years that it's possible to commit a terror attack with a knife or with a car, or, you know, so you write in the book about substitution effects, I think, where the sort of terrorism will find a way to express itself in society. Really, what, you know, I think you said the point that stuck with me was, I think you say a society with zero terrorism is probably a totalitarian state. That's the only, you know, you'd have to go that far in order to be secure that no terrorism would be possible. And even then, I guess, you know, a suicide attack is still something you could imagine happening in a totalitarian state.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we've seen totalitarian states in the 20th century, and there was still terrorism, or there was something that was called terrorism by the totalitarian state that we would probably call resistance.
When you look around the world, do you see a great variety of counterterrorism approaches, or has there been in this century a kind of homogenization effect where, I guess, America sets the tone and everyone else gets in step and follows the same practices?
I would argue that we are seeing homogenization. And it's partly because the war on terror was so all-reaching and so all-encompassing. It was very helpful for many states. There were huge sums of money involved in it. And so states have adopted similar practices, basically. We do see, and this isn't just a 21st century thing, I should say, because we tend to see similar practices throughout history when we see counterterrorism, irrespective of the type of terrorism, irrespective of the groups and their ideologies. So we tend to see that we tend to see quite harsh counterterrorism measures, such as detention, which is beyond the rule of law, such as assassination, targeted killing, sort of getting rid of leaders, in particular, leadership decapitation. And we tend to see things like torture and the relaxation of human rights and civil liberties. And we've seen that historically. We saw it in the period of anarchist terrorism. We saw it during the Cold War. We saw it during separatist terrorist movements throughout the 20th century. And during the war on terror, there were internationally, there were experts, there were practitioners. There was an awful lot of funding involved for states from the US in order to undertake these counterterrorism activities. And so there's sort of an outflow from the US, but it doesn't begin with them. And it is important to say that because, this, as I said, these practices pop up historically in different geographical areas. But what we've seen is that these practices are being used still in countries across the world. And even when we perhaps in 2024, we perhaps think the war on terror feels like it's over. We don't hear that much about it anymore. But the practices have been embedded in the way that states do counterterrorism. And so you don't have to talk about the war on terror. It's there, it's within the institutions and the ways of doing things.
So certain practices have been normalized for security services. And do you think they've also achieved a certain degree of public tolerance, if not acceptance, that perhaps there is a price worth paying and certain things happen, drone attacks are targeted but cause a lot of collateral damage, to use an offensive phrase. Do you think there's a public a sort of public readiness to tolerate, if not to sort of embrace the things which have been done in the name of counterterrorism, especially in the last quarter of a century?
Yeah, I do think so. I think that norms have been changed. Norms have been, there's been a relaxation of norms over in the 21st century. And perhaps there are groups that fight against this and that keep these things on the agenda and that argue, we shouldn't accept these changes in norms and these legal changes. But I do think there is a degree of tolerance, and it's to do with the fact that the norms are changing, and when norms change, that implies a degree of sort of broader social acceptance. But that's not to say that they can't change back. So I don't want to be too negative or pessimistic about this, because it is problematic that norms are changing, and we're seeing it in conflicts right now, that norms are changing, and but people are speaking out against this. So we do need to recognize that it's not a sort of one-way street. Things can change for the better as well as for the worse.
Because, as we said at the beginning, if you start out with a narrative that's black and white and you put some people beyond the pale, that's a difficult starting position from which to argue back that you've got to take a more nuanced approach, that perhaps everybody who's classified as a suspected terrorist may not be a legitimate suspicion, and that treatment of wider populations, guilt by association is problematic. But if you start from this sort of black and white view of the world, it's hard to introduce shades of grey, isn't it, into the public debate, because you're seen as being an apologist for terror or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And this is why terrorism, counterterrorism is all about storytelling. And so if you can tell a story that reaches wide exceptions, that this is a black and white situation, then that can get you so far. But if you introduce those shades of grey by demonstrating that yes, not everyone who is suspected of being a terrorist may be a terrorist. And also, we live in in liberal democratic societies, we live in a world where the rule of law should rule, irrespective of what crime has been committed. And so I think that bringing in those shades of grey is so important, and that is where those norms get changed in that kind of discussion. and in wrestling with the implications of that black and white thinking.
Yeah. And are there forums, are there ways in which people like you who are studying counterterrorism from an academic point of view interface with people on the policy side, people who are implementing policy, people who are actually thinking about laws and how those are applied? In other words, what is there some way of apart from writing books like the one you've written, is there some way of sort of reaching beyond the academic community and starting this argument or advancing this argument or opening up the dialogue so that the world ceases to be seen in quite such black and white terms?
Um, Policymakers are, a diverse bunch of people. We see in the UK, for example, one of the key counterterrorism issues at the minute is to do with the number of people who are now held in northern Syria in refugee camps, who were associated with Islamic State. And there are several people from Britain there, including several families, several children, right, who are obviously innocent. And there are all party parliamentary groups that are dedicated to looking at this issue and looking at how the fact that they are understood as terrorists, that this label sticks to these people and the problems with that. And obviously there are tens of thousands of people in those camps from all over the world. So this is not just a problem for one state to deal with.
Yeah.
It's a problem it's an international issue. And so people, counterterrorism experts, but also families, also NGOs, also kind of lawyers and social workers and healthcare professionals are all crucially involved in those conversations and in helping to remove that black and white thinking that everyone who was in Syria while Islamic State were ruling it is somehow a terrorist or terrorist adjacent in some problematic way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a problem, as a classic counterterrorism problem, because it's being dealt with in a very black and white way by many states. But it will create grievances. It will create security problems. It's a problem for down the line. It will come back and it has to be dealt with and thought through. And obviously there are very hardline ways to deal with that, which many states have taken and many states are taking. And there are more, there are approaches which are more within the rule of law and more within understanding the civil liberties of those involved, which potentially will have much better solutions, both for human rights, which is obviously a problem, but also crucially for security, which is what counterterrorism is supposed to deal with.
Yeah. And would you say a broad swathe of the political class and the policymaking class understand that there are remedies that would work better, but they worry, in this country about what the Daily Mail would say or about what would happen in the ballot box? It's not the lack of creative, constructive thinking about what would work better than the securitized approach. But I guess we're returning to something we touched on earlier, but just, the political consequences of being perceived to be, in quotes, soft on terror.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. Very definitely an issue. But we have seen these powers be rolled back with fewer political consequences than perhaps were expected. So we have seen that happen. We have seen very harsh counterterrorism measures be rolled back. The public opinion is a problem. It is a problem, but the Daily Mail, I know it's very vociferous, but it is not the container of all public opinion, and it's really unhelpful for politicians and policymakers to think that there are shades, and many people in many countries view harsh counterterrorism measures as problematic. And so I think we always, when we're talking about counterterrorism, the security versus human rights argument is always central to all these conversations. We hear it constantly from policymakers when they're making laws that, you know, we need to balance security against human rights. And what tends to happen is that security comes out on top of that.
Yeah.
But there is there are ways for us to re-articulate the balance between security and human rights in a way that demonstrates, because there is plenty of evidence that shows this, that protecting human rights protects security, and that protecting civil liberties can make us more secure.
Yeah. The point to which you come at the end of the book is that seeing security in a different light is itself quite a useful exercise, thinking about human security rather than it being a sort of matter about the state and how it protects its institutions and reputation and so on. Thinking differently about human security can actually broaden the discussion and open up different pathways.
Yeah, exactly. It's about what we want to be secure from, because counterterrorism doesn't secure everyone. You know, there are people who are made very insecure by counterterrorism. And there are people who are made very insecure by the extension of the security state. So if we're thinking about some of the key issues that have come to the fore in the last 5-10 years, you know, about in different societies, but about the way that the state can encroach upon our lives, the way that civil liberties are rolled back, the way that militarized policing can over police some communities and can cause huge insecurity. You know, this is what the Black Lives Matter protests were about, right? That over policing kills people. And so that doesn't make the African American community in some American cities more secure. So thinking about security in a more broad sense will allow us to think more about whether these measures actually help keep us secure, whether the security state is actually a desirable thing.
Yeah. So ineffective, potentially counterproductive, secretive, vastly expensive, undemocratic, and a violation of human rights. So your book brings all these things out, but also suggests ways forward, and you know, it's not a counsel for despair by any means, is it?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. There are some positive shimmers in all of this, and it has been. I do think it's important to recognize that if counterterrorism is a story, then we can change the narrative, and it is possible to do that. It has been done, and it can be done. So it isn't all doom and gloom. There are some positive steps we can take.
And did any parts of the story, did you sort of turn the lens in a particular way when you were researching and writing the book, and see some aspects of your field in a different light, or aspects of its history or its present? Were there sort of moments where you sort of had a sort of shift in your vision or of your perception of it?
I think sitting down to write this and bringing the history of counterterrorism together, it's really quite striking that the story is so similar. Each time there is a terrorist threat that's viewed as existential, we get the same story and we get the same solutions, and obviously they haven't worked, right? So that's really, when you sort of know this as a scholar, but when you sit down and bring all that together, you see it's very, very starkly. But also it was quite wonderful to actually think about positive ways, because I spend a lot of my time as an academic sort of criticizing and moaning about how terrible everything is, but actually to sit down and bring together the work of others that have shown how we can positively respond to some of these issues. It was quite a nice thing to be optimistic for once. So
Yeah. And the book's about to go out in the world and hopefully spread those insights and that potentially optimistic message even further. So thank you very much for talking to me today about it, and for writing the book. And I hope lots of people are going to discover the ideas in it and be made to think a bit further about counterterrorism as a result.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me.